The sky above the English countryside was the color of gunmetal. It was late November 1943, and the cold had crept into everything: boots, bones, bolts. At a remote airbase outside of Norfolk, engines hissed with dying heat as ground crews scrambled beneath the bellies of returning thunderbolts. One of them, tail number 31,982, sputtered as it rolled to a stop, smoke trailing from the cowling. The pilot didn't climb out immediately. He sat, motionless, until the canopy finally cracked open. Then, with trembling hands, he pulled off his oxygen mask and whispered, "She almost killed me this time." Tom Keller stood at the edge of the runway, fists clenched around a wrench. He didn't run to the aircraft. He didn't need to. He already knew what had happened. Another P-47 had almost cooked its own heart mid-flight. Another man nearly died because the damn engine couldn't breathe. Keller wasn't an officer. He wasn't a pilot. He was a sergeant with oil under his fingernails and a reputation for knowing machines like a preacher knows scripture. Born in Wichita Falls, Texas, raised on sun-split gravel roads and the shriek of tractors too old to work right, Tom wasn't afraid of metal. He understood it. More than that, he respected it. But what he didn't respect was design flaws that got men killed. And that's what this Thunderbolt had become. A monster wrapped in armor, with a breathing problem. They say it's a jug. The mechanics would joke. Flies like one, too. But to Keller, it wasn't funny. He had seen too many men walk away from that plane shaking, drenched in sweat, muttering about engine tongue, climbing past redline, and oil pressure disappearing at altitude. That day, after the last aircraft had been rolled into the hangars, and the pilots were drinking their nerves away in the briefing tent, Keller stayed behind. Alone in the icy silence of the workshop, he unlatched the cowling of tail, number 31,982, and stared at the scorched ducts. "She's suffocating," he muttered. "And no one's doing a damn thing about it." The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine was a masterpiece on paper. It was massive, powerful, and capable of extraordinary endurance. But in combat, it ran hot. Too hot. The P-47's intake system was supposed to feed the supercharger and cool the oil lines, but the ducts were narrow, and the airflow was weak. In high-altitude dogfights, the engine would choke on its own heat. Pilots called it the metal coffin. Keller had written reports, filled out the forms, requested parts. Nothing came. Command kept sending memos about operating within parameters and avoiding unauthorized alterations. But parameters didn't mean much when your friends were dying in the sky. That night, Keller made a decision that would change the course of the war for dozens of men and would nearly end his career. He locked the hangar doors, grabbed a hacksaw, and started cutting. What he did wasn't by the book. Hell, it wasn't even in the book. He widened the air intake by 6 inches, removed a section of the cowling entirely, and rigged a custom baffle using scavenged aluminum from a wrecked Spitfire. The welds were ugly. The modification looked like a tumor growing out of the fuselage. But when he started the engine the next morning, it didn't growl, it roared. The temperature gauge barely moved. The oil lines held steady. For the first time in weeks, the Thunderbolt breathed out by sunrise. The word had spread. You see what Keller did to 982? They say she ran cool all the way to 25,000. They say it worked. The officers weren't amused. Captain Drennan stormed into the hangar, eyes blazing. "Sergeant Keller," he barked, "you unauthorized a field modification on government aircraft?" Keller looked up from his wrench. "No, sir." "You didn't?" "No, sir. I authorized it myself." The other mechanics stopped moving. You could have heard a socket drop. Keller stood up, wiped his hands on a rag, and faced the officer. "With respect, sir, these birds are frying their own engines. We keep patching them. They keep breaking. I figured I'd try fixing one instead. Drennan's jaw clenched. You'll be lucky if you're not court-martialed for this. Keller nodded. Yes, sir. But if I am, I'll be the first one busted for keeping a man alive. There was a long silence. Then the captain turned and walked out. But the next mission told the real story. Tail, number 31,982, flew escort over Lyle. 5 Thunderbolts went up that morning. 2 came back smoking. 1 didn't come back at all. And Keller's plane? It returned clean. Not a flicker on the temp gauge. Ringo Donovan, the hotshot pilot from Kentucky, climbed out, pulled off his gloves, and said only one thing. Whatever you did, Keller, do it again. And so he did. One by one the birds came in, each with Keller's illegal fix, each performing better than anything Command had ever seen. The changes weren't flashy. They were simple. More air, less heat, better breathing. The kind of thing a man learns after 10 years fixing engines in dust storms. The pilots began to whisper about him. The guy who makes the jug fly. The grease monkey who saved my skin. Some started asking for him by name. Keller didn't say much. He just worked. And every night, when the hangar was quiet and the sky above was littered with stars, he'd lean against the wing of a Thunderbolt, light a cigarette, and whisper to the metal, "You're not perfect, but you'll get there." But war doesn't let heroes walk in peace. The brass had noticed, and they didn't like what they saw. He was summoned to Division HQ, a panel of 3 officers. All clean boots, clean hands. They asked him the questions he expected. Did you perform unauthorized alterations? Yes, sir. Do you understand the consequences? Yes, sir. Do you have any defense for your actions? Keller took a deep breath. Yeah, 59 pilots went up last month. 48 came back. Every one of those who flew with my fix made it home. If that's a crime, I'll take the punishment. The senior officer didn't respond. He just opened a folder, flipped through a few pages, and finally said, "You'll be notified of disciplinary actions within the week." But the very next day, a new memo hit the bulletin boards at the base. Field Modification Protocol Alpha K7 authorized for evaluation. Maintenance personnel instructed to implement airflow improvements per field-tested adaptation. No name, no credit. No apology, just a quiet nod to the man who refused to follow the rules because the rules weren't saving lives. And somewhere, far above the clouds, 5 Thunderbolts flew escort over the German border. Their engines cool, their pilots steady, and their hearts still beating low, because one man broke the book open and rewrote the chapter on survival. By early 1944, the Thunderbolts of the 361st Fighter Group had developed a new reputation, not just as flying tanks, but as birds that always came home. Pilots from neighboring airfields started asking questions. Why aren't your jugs overheating? What's Keller doing to them? Some whispered that the Texas mechanic had struck a deal with the devil. Others said he was touched by God, but the truth was far less glamorous. He was just listening to the machine, and listening to the men who risked their lives flying it. Tom Keller's modifications had become a quiet revolution. Official memos never mentioned his name, but word spread through the hangars like wildfire. Mechanics copied his custom baffles, widened ducts, and repositioned cowlings. It wasn't regulation, but it worked. And the pilots noticed. One of them was Lieutenant Ben McAllister. At 22, Ben had already flown 39 combat missions, survived a mid-air collision, and earned a Silver Star. But what he remembered most wasn't the medals. It was the sound of his engine trying to quit at 28,000 feet over Frankfurt. Ben had walked into Keller's hangar one freezing January morning, his leather jacket stiff with frost. You, the guy who makes these beasts behave? Keller, crouched under a Thunderbolt's wing, didn't look up. I make and breathe. That's all. Ben grinned. That's more than Command's been able to do. From that moment, a bond formed, not just between two men, but between a flyer and a fixer, a pilot and the only person on the ground who could understand what it meant to stake your life on a screaming engine and a fragile wing. Ben became Keller's test case. Every time Tom dreamed up a new tweak-a-modified oil vent, a deflector shield, a pressure bypass, Ben would fly it into the sky and bring it back with a grin, or a scowl, or sometimes a white-knuckled silence that said, "Try again." Together, they built the safest, fastest, most reliable Thunderbolt on the base. Tail number 33,012. The crew called her Gracie. She was ugly as sin, with a crooked intake and scorched paint. But she flew like a dream. Ben said flying Gracie felt like riding a storm and knowing the lightning wouldn't strike you. Keller began working nights now, not because he had to, but because the base's command was still watching him. They couldn't officially approve his changes, but they weren't stopping him either. It was a silent standoff. Make the jugs better, but don't let the brass catch you doing it. But war doesn't pause for perfection. In March 1944, the Luftwaffe shifted tactics. Instead of scattered dogfights, they began concentrated assaults on bomber squadrons over Germany. Fighter groups like the 361st became lifelines for the B-17s and B-24s, limping across enemy skies. On March 12th, 24 P-47s launched from Norfolk to escort a formation of bombers headed for Leipzig. Among them was Ben McAllister and Gracie. As the formation crossed into enemy airspace, flak filled the sky like a black hailstorm. Minutes later, Messerschmitts dove from the sun, spitting fire. The radio crackled with panic. "Red leader, I've got two on me. Break left. Break left. I've lost visual." Ben's voice came through calm, clipped. "This is McAllister. 2 bogeys at 7 o'clock. Engaging." What followed was 8 minutes of chaos. Thunderbolts twisting through smoke trails. Cannons thundering. Bombers spiraling into the trees. But Gracie held her line. Ben took out one enemy fighter, damaged another, and covered a B-17's escape with half a wing shot away. When he landed, smoke trailed from his left engine nacelle. The landing gear groaned. The base's medics were already rolling as Gracie slid to a stop. Tom Keller ran dot by the time he reached the cockpit. Ben was climbing out, blood on his face, but smiling. "She's tougher than you said." Keller. Tom stared at the wrecked wing. The cracked intake, the bullet holes lining the fuselage. "And you're crazier than I hoped." That night, they drank in the mechanic's tent. Just the two of them. No toasts, no speeches. Just the shared silence of men who had danced with death and survived. But the war wasn't done taking. 3 weeks later, Ben didn't return. The mission was routine. A short hop to escort bombers over northern France. Keller had personally double-checked every bolt on Gracie. But when the formation came back, she wasn't with them. Reports were scattered. Saw him dive through cloud cover after a bomber. Last visual near Rouen. Radio cut out mid-transmission. For days, Keller didn't speak. He sat in the hangar, staring at the empty bay where Gracie used to rest. Every sound, the clang of a tool, the roar of an engine, was a reminder. He'd saved so many. But not this one. Then came the telegram. LT, Benjamin McAllister reported missing in action, presumed captured. It hit harder than death. Death had closure. Death had a grave. But this? This was silence. Weeks passed. Missions flew. Planes returned. And Keller worked. More than ever. as if by fixing machines he could undo time. Then one morning in May, a jeep rolled into base. The driver wore a crooked smile, his face thinner, his arm in a sling. Got room for one more jug? Ben. He'd crash-landed in a French field, evaded capture for 11 days, then joined a local resistance cell before sneaking across the lines with stolen ID papers. When Keller saw him, he didn't speak. Just walked over, handed him a wrench, and said, "Gracie's got a bent shaft. You want to help fix her?" Ben laughed. "Only if you're doing the welding." That summer, they rebuilt the plane from scratch. And the legend grew, not of generals or medals, but of a pilot who trusted a mechanic more than his own parachute, and of a mechanic who turned bolts into lifelines. By the fall of 1944, the war in Europe was shifting. The Allies were pushing east after the Normandy breakout. Paris had been liberated. Rumors whispered that Hitler's days were numbered. But to the men of the 361st Fighter Group, peace was just a distant rumor. Every morning still began with the scream of engines and the smell of oil. And for Tom Keller, every day started under the belly of a P-47, checking, tuning, tweaking. Gracie had flown 67 missions by then, each one a testament not just to the engineers who designed her, but to the hands that kept her flying and the soul who flew her like she was born with wings. Ben McAllister returned from his Mia ordeal sharper, grittier, and quieter. The laughs came slower now, but the bond between him and Keller had grown stronger. Two men who no longer needed words. But war doesn't wait for healing. In October, Keller received a classified memo: new orders, retrofitting P-47s for high-altitude escort missions deeper into German territory. The Luftwaffe was regrouping, and American bombers were suffering. Command had a special assignment, an experimental drop over Dresden. High risk, long range, and only the best aircraft would fly it. Gracie was one of them. The week before the mission, Keller worked without rest. He pulled the manifold, replaced the ignition coil, recalibrated the turbo supercharger, and modified the oxygen feed line himself. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat much. He just worked. When another mechanic joked, "You're building a rocket, not a plane," Keller didn't even smile. Ben watched from a distance, knowing. He'd flown Gracie through fire, flak, and fury, but never liked what was coming. The morning of October 17th was foggy. The airbase lay under a pale curtain of mist, and the runway glistened with dew. The flight crew moved like ghosts in wool and steel. Keller stood beside Gracie, hands in his jacket, face pale. Ben approached, suited up, gloves tucked under his arm. "She ready?" Keller nodded, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small metal charm vent, rusted, barely legible. "A piece of an old dog tag. My brother's," Keller said simply. "Bastogne. Never made it home." Ben took it without a word and tied it to the zipper of his flight jacket. "I'll bring it back," he said. Then he climbed into Gracie one last time. The mission took them deep into German airspace. They crossed the Rhine at 22,000 feet, flanked by silver B-17s shimmering in the cold light. Radio chatter was minimal, just the occasional crackle of call signs and altitude checks. The tension hung heavy. Then came the first flak burst thunderclaps in the sky, black blossoms opening in fields of blue. Ben maneuvered through them like water, Gracie responding with the grace of a hawk. Below, Dresden smoked. The bombers began their runs. That's when the German fighters came. Focke-Wulfs, dozens, the air filled with chaos machine guns. Barrel rolls, screams over the radio. Gracie dove to intercept. Keller, back at the base, stood at the radio station, headset on, listening to the madness. The reports came in fast. 2 bogies down, red leader hit. B-17 spiraling, no shoots. Then, This is McAllister. Gracie's venting oil. Still flying. Keller's breath caught. Ben was taking hits. Back in the sky, Gracie was bleeding. Smoke trailed from her fuselage, but her wings held. Ben dropped behind a bomber under attack and opened fire, shredding a Focke-Wulf's tail. Another turned toward him, head-on pass. Bullets shattered the canopy. One tore through Ben's shoulder. He didn't flinch. He gritted his teeth and pulled Gracie into a corkscrew, looped behind his attacker, and lit him up with a 3-second burst. The German exploded mid-air, but Gracie was dying. Lost hydraulics, Ben called in. Flaps unresponsive. Starting glide. Keller paced the hangar like a caged animal. His hands were shaking. He hadn't prayed since he was 10, but now he mumbled to any god that might hear. The rest of the squadron began to return. No sign of Gracie, until a silhouette appeared on the horizon low. Slow, trailing smoke like a wounded bird. She skidded onto the runway. Sparks flying, landing gear half extended. One wing dipped unnaturally low. When she stopped. Keller sprinted. The canopy opened. Ben was slumped over. His flight suit soaked with blood. Medics pulled him out. Keller never saw them lift his body. He just stared at the seat, at the blood-slicked controls, and the rusted dog. Tag hanging from the dash. Ben survived, but the mission was his last. 2 weeks later, the orders came. Ben was grounded permanently. Nerve damage. He could walk, but never fly again. He didn't say much, just sat with Keller in silence. The war would end 5 months later. Peace came with parades. Headlines, flags, but Keller never celebrated. He stayed on base for 3 more months, helping wrap up operations, dismantling the planes he once loved. One afternoon, Gracie was scheduled for decommissioning. A young officer approached Keller with the paperwork. Scrap her, he said. Keller looked at the form, then at the plane. No, he said. She's going home. The officer laughed. And how do you expect to do that? Keller pulled out his pocket knife, carved 33,012 into the side of a wooden crate, and started dismantling Gracie piece by piece. 3 months later, she was in a barn outside Houston. The war had ended, but Tom Keller's life hadn't returned to what anyone might call normal. There were no parades for mechanics, no newspaper headlines for those who turned wrenches instead of throttles. Back in Texas, Keller returned to the same small house on the edge of Temple, with a half-broken fence and a dog that didn't bark anymore. The air was still dry, the soil still cracked, and the nights were still filled with the echoes of engines, though now only in his mind. But in the barn out back, under a blue tarp and between stacks of hay, lay something that didn't belong to the past. Gracie, or at least what was left of her. One wing had been torn in transport. The tail was missing. The engine was in crates. But to Tom, she was still whole, still alive. He spent every weekend in that barn, piecing her together like a memory too precious to forget. Not to fly her, he knew that was over, but to preserve something pure from the war. A story, a bond, a promise. Ben McAllister came to visit once. He wore a shoulder brace and a stiff smile, but his voice was stronger than before. The war had scarred him deeply, but surviving it had given him something unshakable, a quiet pride, a sense that he had done what needed to be done. They sat on wooden crates, surrounded by parts of Gracie, drinking coffee in silence. She saved me, Ben said finally. Keller didn't respond right away. Ben, you saved her. Ben nodded. She wouldn't have made it off the ground without you. Keller took a long sip and stared at the wing in the corner. We wouldn't have made it home without her. Time passed. The 1950s rolled in with jukeboxes and muscle cars. Korea came and went. Keller stayed quiet, content to work in his auto shop by day and the barn by night. Neighbors whispered about the plain guy down the road, but most left him alone. By 1960, Gracie stood on her wheels again, not airworthy but complete, her aluminum skin polished, her nose painted back with the red stripe of the 361st, the cockpit sealed, the gauges cleaned, the joystick bolted in place. She had no engine, but she had heart. Color didn't show her to many. Just Ben, once more, and a couple of local school kids who'd wandered into his yard and asked, "Mister, is that a real airplane?" He'd smiled. The realest one there ever was. But Gracie's story wasn't finished. In 1964, Keller received a letter official looking, marked with a seal from the newly formed Commemorative Air Force. They were building a museum, a collection, a place to preserve not just the planes, but the stories. They wanted to buy Gracie. Keller refused. A month later, they sent someone in person. A Colonel Briggs, retired Air Force, big man, booming voice. "She deserves to be seen," Briggs said. "Kids today don't know what it took to win." Keller looked him in the eye and replied, "That plane is not for sale." But then he added, "You can borrow her." 2 years later, Gracie stood in a polished hangar in Midland, Texas, surrounded by spotlights, visitors, cameras. Next to her was a plaque, P-47D Thunderbolt, number 33012. Gracie, flown in over 70 missions over Europe. Mechanic, SGT, Tom Keller. Pilot, LT, Ben McAllister. Neither forgot. Keller never liked crowds. But he attended the unveiling, sitting in the back with a hat pulled low. Afterward, a young boy approached him, maybe 10 years old, holding a toy plane. "Did you fly her?" he asked. Keller shook his head. "I made sure she could." The boy nodded slowly, then asked, "Was she scared?" That stopped Keller. He thought of the smoke over Dresden, of the bullet holes in her wings, of the dog tag hanging from the dash. "No," he said. But we were. In the years that followed, Gracie became more than an artifact. Veterans would visit, touch her fuselage, stare into her cockpit like it was a time machine. Pilots told their kids, "This one brought my buddy home." Some just stood in silence, tears in their eyes, and every time Keller visited, which was rare, he'd stand in the same spot, hands in his pockets, eyes distant. She was the last of her kind, not because of the model, because of the heart. In 1982, Tom Keller passed away in his sleep. No ceremony, no news. But at the museum, someone noticed a new item in Gracie's cockpit, a folded note. Wedged behind the throttle lever. It read, "Thank you for flying them home. You kept your promise. TK." They left it there. Visitors sometimes ask about it. No one touches it, because some stories don't end. They just land softly and wait to be remembered.